thank you for asking me.
Yeah, all right. All right, we are live. It is Hangops for October 31st, 2014. Got a few folks on. It's earlier than normal. Since we're going to recap DevOps Days Ghent, wanted to get the people who were there. So I'm going to be a little more accommodating to the European brethren and sisterin. I don't know what the plural for sister is. Anyway, all you fine folks. We got a couple people who were there, and I think some more maybe joining a little later. But why don't we just do some quick intros from? We'll go from left to right as I see it. So start with you, Bridget.
Hi, I'm Bridget Krumhout, and I'm talking to you from Amsterdam. There's canals right there. And I'm an operations engineer at Drama Fever and went to DevOps Days Kent. It was fantastic.
Awesome, Chris.
Christopher Weber, chef, and yeah, didn't go, but I'm excited to hear about what people have to say. And I'll ask lots of questions because I'm good at that.
And Frosty. What's up, man?
Hey, buddy. Yeah, I'm Dan, Frosty on all the things. I was also at DevOps Days Ghent, and I'm in Paris. As you can see, there's a bunch of Paris behind me. So,
Cool. All right, well, I'll open it up. Dan and Bridget, either you want to lead off with, telling us a little bit about it, and just kind of to preface that is this was the 5th anniversary of the original DevOps Days in Ghent, so it was definitely a special time for the community to sit and reflect on where we've come, and it seems like a lot of cool things happened. So yeah, I'll open it up to you guys and gals.
Yeah. So I would say I've been to a number of DevOps Days in the last year and a half, and this one definitely had a different feel. Just because usually DevOps Days is very informed by the local community, and this one very much had think I heard someone describe it as a victory lap, but it very much had this is the 5-year anniversary, and so we're going to have all sorts of people who wouldn't necessarily make it to every DevOps Days ever kind of descend upon the sleepy little medieval town of Ghent and transform it. So there was good and bad there, right? Because of course, since you have all sorts of luminaries from Australia and whatever talking, that means you have not so much from Belgium. But at the same time, I think it was really exciting for the people who are actually there, just locally from Belgium, to actually have all of these people from around the world right there. So
yeah,
what do you think, Dan?
yeah, I would echo that. And without parroting what you just said, I'm about to parrot what you just said, which is that it did have less of a local flavor than a lot of the DevOps days do. I've been to a couple of events in different countries, and one of the things that I've always really enjoyed about the DevOps days events is that they are very much a local activity. And as you said, this one was not. This one seemed like an international gathering of DevOps tastemakers and rump shakers, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It was actually really cool to gather a lot of these people in the same place at the same time. But obviously, the obverse of that coin is that it did not feel like a local event. The organizing team, I think, was aware of this going into it, and they did what they could to. I have to be very careful about how I say this. To just try to make it more local, right? To try and give it.
There's a great deal of chocolate.
Precisely. So they served only local beers, and not just Belgian beers, but like beers from Ghent and the area type of a deal, right? And local chocolates. They used local caterers that served Dutch Belgian food exclusively, et cetera, et cetera. So
And something else. Yeah, something else that I thought was actually really nice was, I think at a lot of DevOps days, the one I ran in Minneapolis included, the lunch is very much you sit down and you ended up at a table with a few people, and that's really the only people you're going to talk to during lunch sort of affair. And they, I think, very deliberately actually set lunch up as you're going to mingle. There are going to be cocktail rounds that you're standing at, and there's always just not quite enough room, so that there's always going to be people coming and going from your table, looking for places to eat their lunch. And I think that was I looked at that and thought, where are we going to eat lunch? That was actually fantastic for exactly this reason. In terms of getting people to mingle, I spoke with a lot of local people, a lot of people from the Ghent and surrounding areas, and just people from Belgium who, if I had ended up at a table with just a few people I knew, I might not have ended up meeting all these people who were fantastic. So I think they put a lot of, I'm guessing, I didn't hear this directly from them, but I think they put a lot of thought into the behind the scenes logistics that they would use to make sure that we did all get a chance to mingle with the approximately at least 60% or so, I think, who raised their hands, 60 to 70% who raised their hand when I said, who here has never been to a DevOps Days before or never been to a different DevOps Days than this one?
So this actually brings up an interesting point for me as someone that's, I mean, to be fair, I'm kind of excited. Tuesday, I'm flying to Canada for the first time. Like that's my first time out of the country to a place not Mexico.
Awesome.
And I live in Southern California, so you can guess Mexico is kind of not a big deal. With that said, like the thing that comes to mind immediately when I hear about trips to Europe and whatnot is, how does the language barrier? How do you deal with things of? I'm assuming that English is fairly commonly spoken, but I feel like that's a bad, assumption. So how did the language barriers play out in these kinds of things?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it's an honest question. And the honest answer is that it doesn't always work, right? That's just how it's going to be. You're right when you said that English is spoken pretty much everywhere, but you have to sort of amplify that statement, which is that a certain amount of English is spoken almost everywhere, right? In Europe, the ability of any one individual to carry on a complex conversation on a random topic in English is quite variable from country to country. Some countries, you learn English from a very young age, and it's actually intensely immersive as part of their public education system. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, for example, come to mind. The Netherlands comes to mind. And then there are other countries where English is kind of an afterthought. It's something you take in high school, much like someone in the United States might take Spanish in high school. And in those countries, it's more difficult.
It's interesting you bring that.
Oh, I was going to say, in the specific experience of this conference, we also have to remember that in Belgium, there's a lot of French and a lot of Flemish. So it wasn't even just one other language other than English that we were hearing pretty frequently.
Well, we were in the Dutch. So Belgium separated into the Dutch side and the French side, and then there's a tiny little German corner as well. And we were on the Dutch side, and on the Dutch side, I found in my time in that area of the world that basically everybody is at least trilingual. They speak Dutch, French, and English, and do so with aplomb, frankly, in all three. On the French side of the country and in Brussels, a lot of times people will only speak two languages, French, as you might imagine, and oddly enough, not Dutch. So this causes some friction even inside of the country, which is, I would say it's amusing, but I can say that because I don't live there.
Bridget, you were going to say something, but you were muted at the time.
Oh, sorry. No, I was actually interested in seeing what Brandon was going to say about that topic, just continuing on that topic.
Well, there's a couple things. Dan, I think your perspective is interesting, right? Being a North American who moved to Paris and now has been there for a while and had to sort of do the reverse, right, of acclimating to French language, right? Because you started working in the gaming industry there, right? And which I imagine being there, it was French was the nom de plume, right? So.
That's a good try. I knew some French when I moved here. One of the advantages of being Canadian is that whether you want it or not, you learn some French. I did one better and actually kind of went out of my way to learn conversational French, and I moved to the French-speaking part of the country and got my start there. But just because you can speak the language doesn't mean you can speak the culture. And
Right.
this is I think more important than the language barrier, to be perfectly honest with you. Anyone can learn to speak another language. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a thing you do if you want to. Learning a culture, that's way harder. And there's a growing body of evidence from sociologists and cultural observers that suggests that it might not be entirely possible to learn a new culture as an adult, not completely. And so I would submit to the panel that that in terms of this DevOps days, in terms of language barrier and stuff like that, whether people spoke enough English or not wasn't the real problem. It was cultural expectations, social contract, and these sorts of things that are actually more problematic at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts were going, because like a lot of what DevOps is about as an ethos is transmitting this shared culture, but a lot of that culture is very California, San Francisco centric, because that's where a lot of the money and sort of there's a high cluster of talent there around the industry, and I don't think we can deny that. Not that all the talent's there, but there is a certain clustering there that creates like cultural norms and memes, right, that spread. And like I'm thinking about like even like lolcats or like some of the GIFs or some of the other like memes that we're transmitting, like we're like potentially inadvertently those are barriers of accessibility to both. I mean, they're bigger barriers to like someone in Europe or where the tech culture is very different. There's a language barrier, but even like folks who maybe aren't plugged into that part of the tech industry, someone who's more in like they're in enterprise IT or they're doing like Soho type stuff, like SMB IT, like there's all these cultural constructs that become less accessible if you're not like in the big shared circle on Twitter and following and stuff. And it's interesting, right? Because that's like one of the themes now, like is spreading DevOps, right? Gene Kim just did the DevOps Enterprise Summit, and it seemed very successful. But definitely, like the talks and slide decks that I caught were, I think, a little different. The cultural context of them was different than a lot of DevOps Days type stuff.
The ones from Ghent or the ones from DevOps Enterprise?
The Enterprise Summit content was like, there was less of, I think, the tongue-in-cheek, meme type stuff that I think those of us who've been involved in the DevOps Days community for a long time take as part of the fun, But we kind of take that substrate of the culture for granted.
Yeah, I mean, the two things on that. One, it actually struck me that there was less of the meme type stuff at this DevOps Days than I've definitely seen in the past. I mean, I actually spoke at this one, and I didn't use any lolcats, which I've definitely thrown pictures of my cats in the past. But that was more because I was doing a talk that had a specific theme that cats wouldn't have really worked with. But there were definitely fewer lolcats. But also in terms of just making sure that people felt comfortable, I think it wasn't necessarily like those of us invading from the DevOps Twitter sphere that needed to make the locals comfortable so much as I think Steve Pereira, the organizer from Toronto, made a really good point when he posted on Twitter saying that he was so grateful to all of the people who were deliberately speaking English throughout the conference, like in open space everywhere, to make us comfortable. Since those of us who came in who only speak English, like if there had been, open space or playing games or whatever that was only in Flemish or French, a lot of us would have been inaccessible to us. So I felt really grateful, echoing what he said, that people made the effort to go through an entire 2 days speaking their possibly third language just to make us comfortable.
So, kind of changing topics, but continuing down this process of topics, if you will. One of the things that really struck me as kind of awesome is there was very little. How do I put this? At times, when we've had discussions about DevOps Days, specifically the Silicon Valley DevOps Days, there's been discussion at times of, well, can we just stop talking about freaking tools and talk about culture? And as I'm looking through the program, it was about culture. It's how do we change the way we as an organization operate and move. And I guess my question for both of you is, was that true? Like, did we actually see more of a focus on culture? And as you've been around, since you guys have both been around, or you guys and gals have been around for a while, are we seeing that move? Because originally DevOps, that's the goal, right? Is to be very culture centric. But I think up until very recently, we haven't had the vocabulary nor the push to, maybe not push, but I think you know what I'm saying. So take it away.
So yes, your observation, your initial observation is correct. If you're looking at the program, it should be fairly obvious that there wasn't a lot of talk about tools. In fact, officially there was no talk about tools, although some of the Ignites wandered dangerously close, I would say, to talking about tools, but that's okay. And a lot of the open spaces that were proposed, surprisingly, were also not about tools, which was really good to see, because that is, in my mind, evidence of the internalization of a lot of what we've been talking about, cultural shifts and social shifts that are more important than talking about tools, because that's the attendees who are coming up with these topics. And as Bridget indicated earlier, there was something like 60% of the people who were there, this was their first DevOps days. So I don't know how many of those individuals were proposing topics, but even if it was just a handful of them, clearly this movement towards talking about culture instead of talking about tools was effective at this event.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that different DevOps days are going to pick their programs differently. And I think that there was definitely, again, I hope Patrick does join us a little later so we can talk more about the intent behind how they curated this program. But it was pretty clear to me that we weren't just necessarily talking about, tools, and it wasn't all just organizational stuff either. There were actually some talks, and I'm thinking specifically of Dave Mango. Is that how I say his name? Dave Mango's talk, and also Nigel Kirsten's talk, where they specifically talked about like the human brain, human mind, consciousness, cognitive bias, the ways that we interact with each other as humans that are both, like organically imprinted on our brains that we can sometimes hack around, and also like the way that just as tribes evolving on the savannah, we relate to each other in terms of in-group and out-group, and just ways we can work around that so that we don't have to think of, whomever we're othering as the them, whether it's the devs or the enterprise or whatever. We don't have to think of them as them, but we can look at the commonalities between us instead of the differences. So, I mean, those I think were fantastic talks, and I'm just calling out a couple, but really they were all along those lines and really great. But I thought that was kind of something I'm definitely interested in seeing more of at future DevOps days, is getting more of those talks in that tie to cognitive neuroscience and the humanities, places where there's a lot more than 5 years of research out there that is pretty relevant to what we're doing.
Just as to put a coda on that, earlier today I was at the Open World Forum here in Paris, and I was on a panel discussion about DevOps. And this is a very different group of people. A lot of people who've maybe never encountered DevOps, who work in banks and insurance companies and so on and so forth. And one of the questions from the audience was, can you name one specific thing that I can bring to my managers that can help us move into DevOps? Right? This was the question. And the panel that we had, there was four of us, there were two developers on the panel, and they both agreed that implementing continuous integration is a thing you should do to do DevOps. And I had to bite my tongue on that a little bit. There was another gentleman who had a reasonable response, but my response, frankly, was, look, find your tastemakers in your organization, in all parts of it, right? Which is the marketing, HR, operations, dev, management. Bring key actors together from across the organization. Put them on a plane or a train or a boat and send them to a DevOps days. Right? That is one key thing you can do to move in a DevOps direction.
The key stakeholders, if you will.
Exactly.
Whoever wants to go out for steak. And what was the response to that?
Well, I relate things sort of flippantly, so everybody kind of got a bit of a chuckle out of it. But I'd like to think that maybe if it only sinks into a handful of people there and they bring that to their managers at their banks or insurance companies or whatever it is that they work, that could have a positive effect, right? I mean, for the people in the audience who are just looking for do everything in Travis CI, okay, well, yeah, I mean, that's a good tool. So good, right?
Well,
Yeah.
and it's funny because I'm having this conversation, and not in the terms of DevOps, but in just the generic conversation with a colleague, and she had mentioned that she sent an email out to the team, and the team each individually responded separately, and as opposed to replying all to make sure everybody was aware of the response. And that's that idea, right? Like, it's how do you change that culture? How do you change that mentality where the organizations I've grown up in, and especially over the last couple of years, you absolutely wouldn't just send one email to one person. You would send it to the entire team because you want the entire team to have all of that knowledge and that sharing. And it's not always that simple in certain organizations. And so even if you're just handling it at that level, starting with the small stuff.
I would actually say if an organization doesn't even have a budget for or necessarily the knowledge or desire to send people to a conference right off the bat, what you just mentioned about sharing, if you can even just get an organization to use chat, not chat ops even, just chat, that can make such a huge difference.
Well, even using email, right? Like if you can get them
But
to.
the problem with email is what you were just saying. Like you can't necessarily. We've kind of had discussions about this in terms of even like direct messages inside chat at our organization where I work at Drama Fever. We're kind of against direct messages just because that ends up not being in the searchable Slack history for other people. And so if you can do stuff in a public channel, even just a channel that's just you and the person that you're talking to, but at least it's out there and it's searchable so that other people can get help from that later, it's so much better.
That makes complete sense. And I think the other aspect here that we don't talk enough about is there are local conferences a lot of times, and DevOps days are usually this case as well. Like, there's a point at which us as operations professionals, we need to do a little bit of investment ourselves. I'm not saying go spend $3,000 to go to Cisco Live on your own, because that's insane. But I will say straight up, if you are in the Los Angeles area and you can't, and you work in operations and you can't find the $50 or I'm sorry, it's like $100 to go to scale, like you should do that, because if all you do is take the few minutes to or spend time in the hallway. In fact, Scale's a great example. If all you do is spend the $10 to go to the expo hall and spend your time in the hallway, you will get that back tenfold in the conversations you'll have in the hallways.
Absolutely. But I mean, it's also like trying to get people to know that they even want to go to an event where they're going to, that's kind of back to the whole learning from people who are different from one another. I think that's why it's really great that Gene Kim and John Willis and everyone else did put on the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And I will definitely go on record as saying that I think enterprise DevOps is nonsense, because that's like saying, You need a special DevOps if your company is this size. But if you're Fortune 50, then you need even more special super secret DevOps. I mean, it's ridiculous. But if it's an easier step, I think, to get this idea of learning from people who are more like you, and then you can take a step to say, hey, okay, people who are just like me in some way are doing this, and maybe I can take one more step and learn a little bit more from people who are a little bit different from me. I mean, change is hard and scary, and so any barrier that we can lower to make it easier for people to try something new, I'd say that's great.
The irony, I think, is Damon Edwards actually pointed out on DevOps Cafe recently. If you're a startup, you probably actually don't have a DevOps problem. If you can walk into a room with all of your engineers and be like, we're all going to change our direction and do this thing, you probably don't have a DevOps problem. Whereas if you walk into some of the large organizations and you can't even have conversations around, you know, I don't even know who the developers are on this project. I just get code from some, magical mystery repository. You probably have a DevOps problem.
Well, we had a I say this like the royal we, right? I was approached a couple of times at the DevOps Days in Ghent by people who had never been to DevOps Days before, were just kind of there exploring more about it. And these sorts of questions came up, and I feel like it was good to be regrounded again, in a way. We spend a lot of time in the DevOps echo chamber, right? And so, as we alluded to earlier, in this Hangops session, we're on the Twitter feeds, we're on the IRCs, we go to the parties, et cetera, et cetera. And so for us, a lot of this just makes sense. It's all very natural. But for people who, oh, hello there in the background, hi. For us, it's very natural. But for people who have never come to one of these events before, or just encountering this word because they saw an ad for DevOps tools and their manager wanted to know if they should buy it, it was actually, as I said, really, really good to be grounded again, to go, hey, look, there's a narrative, and we think that we've solved this narrative, but we clearly haven't. So there's work to be done there.
Agreed, and it's interesting always those conversations we have with folks, right? Of I get that you should be using Chef or Puppet in your environment. Like that has been a thing for me for probably the last 3 to 4 years. But the number of people that you still run into today, and that's a discussion. Whereas for most of us, that's table stakes. It's really interesting, and DevOps is the same way. We'll have meetups in LA, and we always do an open discussion regularly. And the frequency in which it does come back up. So what it actually is DevOps is kind of interesting.
Yeah, also, like, I feel like even just from our recapping Ghent, it seems like there's a little bit of a bifurcation happening in the community a little bit. Like, those of us who are like have been around for a while, like, we talk about how do we get over culture, you sing the praises of stuff that's like cognitive science and advanced stuff, and I've really enjoyed some of Andrew's stuff around Andrew Clay Schaefer at Little ID. His talks in the last couple of years have been a lot like Conway's Law and continual learning, and like that side of it. And so I think in some ways, like, we've gotten over the how do we just stop talking about tools hump by getting in some ways very kind of meta about this stuff. It's like, we're exploring, like, what can we learn from psychology? What can we learn from emergency response? What can we learn from organizational learning? But then you've got people on the other side who are coming in like how do I'm told I should do something more than like do it 5.sh. They're very much at the beginning. And so it seems like there's a little bit of a divide happening. And it's like, I'm wondering, like, how do we make that not be a chasm, but maybe, it's always going to be probably a series of hurdles or plateaus or something. Like, there's like these plateaus, and like we have to pull an analogy out of my tuchus, set of plateaus that you have to ascend. How do we maintain a good set of ladders that people can climb to keep getting from one plateau to the next, in terms of sort of their own like internal continual learning and journey in this stuff?
I think that's actually I think Nathan probably has some really good ideas on that, and so I want to see Nathan joined us, and I want to hear what he has to say about that. But I think that that's always going to be like a struggle again when, from the perspective of an organizer trying to set the programming up. You want programming that's going to be accessible to people, like you're saying, who are in different places in their journey. But I think that's why it's even more important to have a talk about cognitive science and then dip in and talk about a little of this, a little of that. Lindsay Homewood's talk, where he talked about kind of the state of the art of monitoring and metrics, was a good example in that he talked about tools, but from a pretty high level, where if it's not a tool you're using and you don't care, it's not like you had to sit through 45 minutes of hearing about graphite. But at the same time, if you're totally new, then you're getting ideas. And I did talk to some people who were telling me about all the notes that they took during that talk to get ideas of things that they should be looking at. So, and I took things away from that talk myself, even though I had used not every, but a majority of the tools he mentioned. So I think making sure you have talks that can work on multiple levels is pretty important.
Just as an aside, I'm really liking the synchronicity of watching it get darker behind Bridget as it gets darker behind me. Normally, I don't get to have this effect on Hangops, so this is quite nice.
That's great. I do think it's interesting to look at, how do we make sure that we're helping everyone along this DevOps journey, right? One of the things that I talked about in my Ignite talk was version control systems. I think that, version control is a great tool that I think we have a little bit of a challenge in that we just assume that everyone's using proper version control, and it's not always the case. And it's not to say anything negative about the people that aren't. They just haven't made that leap yet. And I think that's important that we discuss those things that are for the beginners, for the people that are really looking to level up their DevOps within their organization, and not, talking about culture is certainly important. Is certainly something that you can take away. But there are also some hard skills that are required that you can walk away from a thing like a DevOps Days with. One of the sessions that I led was an Ask Me Anything session. So during the first day, I was talking to some people, and there were some questions that were very much beginner questions, and I was concerned that at a 5-year anniversary, of course we're going to reflect on the past 5 years, but for many people in the room, it was their first time there. So I actually had someone ask me, I see this on Twitter all the time and I don't know what it means, and it's the letters OH followed by some phrase, and I don't know what that means. And so that it kind of, I see a couple of people kind of chuckling, but like, think back. There was a time, I'll admit, there was a time when I was first on Twitter. I asked a colleague, like, where do I go to find the official hashtag list? Because I don't want to put something on the wrong hashtag. I want to make sure it's on the official one, right? And of course, there's no such thing as an official hashtag. Like, it's looking at it now, it's a completely ridiculous question. But
well, I actually had to Google to try to find out what the heck RT meant. So
right,
just like this RT thing that people say.
I mean,
there does need to be a glossary. I had someone at this DevOps Days ask me what bike shedding was, and he was like, "What? You keep saying that. What are you talking about?"
And I'll say that we brought 100 yak shaving stickers at the chef table, and they were the first stickers that we ran out of. By the way, Chris Weber, I need you to send me some more yak shaving stickers, please.
Yes, sir.
But I also think back to the way that I first discovered DevOps. Literally, I was sitting at a conference. I was sitting at a Rails conf, sitting at a presentation in a Rails conf, and someone said, "A hashtag does not a movement make." And they were talking about the DevOps hashtag. To which I said, "Oh, sweet, there's a new hashtag I should follow on Twitter and find out what the fuck's going on." "Oh, sorry, I don't know what's the policy at Hangops," and I just said the thing that I probably shouldn't have said. But in any case, like, that's how I was like first exposed to DevOps, was someone complaining that a hashtag isn't a real thing, and obviously 5 years in, as it turns out, it was kind of a real thing. But I think that, sort of going back to Bridget's point about, what can we do to help new folks along? I held this Ask Me Anything session. Some of the questions that came up were things like that had nothing to do with Twitter. Were, what is a game day? So we had a really interesting discussion talking about game days and what those are. There were other things that were more kind of in line with conferences. How do you find inspiration to write a blog post? How do you give a conference talk? What's the difference between an Ignite and a Lightning talk? All of these were questions that came up in the Ask Me Anything session. Frankly, I've run a couple of open spaces, 3 this past month, and I think that an Ask Me Anything session where it's clear that it's and just by the way, an Ask Me Anything session or an AMA session, the thing that I did was I walked into the room and I wrote down on the flip chart, no question is off limits. This is a safe space. Anyone can ask a question and anyone can answer a question, and that's how we sort of kicked off that whole discussion. And I found it was really helpful. So I do think that maybe we should propose an AMA session for the beginning of each open spaces event that we hold, whether it's DevOps or some other.
What I actually did, I had the privilege of speaking first at Chicago earlier this month. And so because of feedback that I had gotten from Minneapolis, where some people had said, hey, there's so many things that seem to be jargon, and you had this little idea, Rouser of DevOps Rabble guy introducing Patrick, but who's he and why do we care? There were things like that where getting feedback from people saying that they felt immediately wondering, am I really part of this? Does this make sense for me if there's all this stuff that seems like an in-joke that only the cool kids know or whatever? So for Chicago, I started with like a whole bunch of glossary information and like, here's a giant info dump and cheat sheet of all of the things that you can now go click on and have some idea of what people might be talking about. Because I don't think it's realistic, tying back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't think it's realistic to say, hey, DevOps is totally matured now, and so we don't need to have jargon or in-jokes. Every organization, every group of people, every group of 2 or more people is going to have some kind of shared cultural context and shared experience, and that's fine as long as you can give people the previously on DevOps.
It's funny you say that because I felt that way for a long time, and I feel like I'm just now starting to get a grasp on who's who and where things stand. Like Andrew Clay Schaefer is a great example of. I knew him from having seen him at DevOps Days and him being related to DevOps, but to know that he was there, and this is really funny because I was a fairly early Puppet user. I didn't realize that he was involved in Puppet early on. Like that's where his kind of background comes from, and it's interesting how so many of us don't have. Well, none of us have a complete context, and the amount of contextual information that exists inside our community is kind of scary, actually. But I don't think that's specific to DevOps. I think that is common in all fields, and tech just happens to be really bad. There's just a lot of context, whether it be technical or non-technical context, that you need when you're trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and actually, it reminds me of something that I was explaining to someone there. I couldn't remember the name of it, but I just finally did. This thing called the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it kind of describes like 5 levels of skill. There's like novice, advanced, beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. And it talks about like going through those. And we were talking earlier about kind of like the idea of these plateaus and enjoying these talks that are more exploring like what we can learn from cognitive science. Like, it's got me thinking maybe I or someone else, if someone else wants to, we should try to put together like what are the like DevOps, what is the DevOps model of skills acquisition? Maybe come up with some kind of rough framework for that to help keep that stuff on point.
It seems to me, and I'm going to go a little bit off topic here, but it seems to me that a lot of what we were talking about at DevOps Days, Ghent, and a lot of what is being talked about in other events and other, the thought leaders around DevOps right now is really less and less and less to do with technology and more to do with psychology and sociology and biochemistry and so on and so forth. And this, for me, has 2 very interesting implications. Implication number 1 is that we now have a bunch of technologists pretending to know something about psychology. So how's that going to play out? And implication number 2 is that we now get to draw from a pool of research and understanding and knowledge that has been researched to a far greater degree than the technology we purport to be experts in. So there's a double-edged sword there, right? We are now novices, right? We're at that skill level 1 acquisition you were just talking about. And yet somehow we've managed to position ourselves at a much higher level. It's the beer talking now, because I don't really know where I'm going with this.
No,
but I
there's
think it's just an observation.
No, it's true. Well, there's a really interesting parallel, right? The last like 2, 3, I don't know, maybe it's been all week, but there's been this ongoing discussion in the bigger like distributed systems part of Twitter, which has a lot of overlap with the DevOps part, about and this actually also ties back into the language barrier we were talking about with non-native English speaking. It's like there's folks out there that are writing things that like a certain unnamed caching system that has evolved into more of a distributed database, and then discussions about, well, like there's a lot of papers, right? There's a lot of computer science literature out there. Why, like how could you not, like some people were like, you should learn from this. Other people were like, how could you not read it in the first place? There's there's been a whole gradient of approaches from nice to like lambasting. But I saw a couple tweets I think this morning where people were like, sort of tongue in cheek, but how could you, how dare you not go read this giant body of canonical literature that's not in your native language. So it's like there's these contexts, right, that can become lost, and some of it has to do with what we assume someone who's in open source, in technology, in the web world, like we assume their cultural contexts. You know what I mean? And so this becomes a discussion where, and I think there's through the discussion there's been a thread of value that is like there is research. We should learn from that. Like if you're going to build a distributed system, there are principles, and that's the same thing we're saying here. Like if we're going to draw inspiration from psychology, cognitive sciences, behavioral sciences, the biochem stuff, right, with the like the sleep statistic stuff that the Etsy guys have been doing, like the sleep tracking, integrating that with the Ops Keeper,
Yeah,
and
that's actually
yeah.
that's really interesting that you bring that up, because if you think about it, yeah, absolutely, we're all just, we don't necessarily have a ton of expertise in, and yet are we looking at what's come before it? I mean, Patrick Dubois actually gave a really interesting talk, kind of looking back at 5 years of DevOps when he came and spoke at DevOps Days Minneapolis, where he explicitly called out, when we move on to something new, are we going to look at what we might be losing? Are we going to look at what we're standing on top of? Are we going to look at what we're building on, as well as what we're moving towards? That's a really interesting point that you make.
I'm just saying that whatever we do, we can't stop hearing about awesome airplane crashes, because that's been my favorite part of the DevOps thing, is the amount that I am now scared to fly. In fact, actually, quite frankly, I'm actually reassured to be able to fly, just the frequency in which that's come up as examples. But, I do wonder, though, and just kind of postulating, since that's what I seem to do sometimes, this idea of, I think for most of us as technologists, as time goes by, we don't really get that much deeper into things. We do to a point, but we're constantly getting just a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things, the breadth. And I wonder if that's just true. We're starting to branch that breadth out beyond just the technical realms. And my hope is most of us understand that it's breadth and not depth, but there is that worry that we will take things that are not very deep and start having discussions as if they are very deep, if that makes a sense. Any sense, rather?
Yeah, well, and I think one of the takeaways here, both like as we as folks in the community are entering this novice and even like advanced beginner into other fields, as Frosty pointed out, as well as if we are more of competent, proficient, into expert on something, and we're trying to dispense advice, especially in a medium like Twitter that's very compact and often devoid of nuance, is that I think the humility is the underlying key to all of this. Is maintaining. That's one of the big corollaries, I think, of, we talk about the no asshole rule, right? Adam Jacobs. I think one of the keys of that is trying to have a humility in both, like, what am I, when you're trying to acquire new knowledge, it's having humility to assume that you are starting as a novice, and in your approach to other people, and humility in seeking knowledge, but also humility in transmitting knowledge, I think is what I see as, like, that's been where I've grown the most and been most effective personally, and I think in some ways we strive for that in the DevOps Days community, of having a sort of a no ego humility, sort of an ethos. It waxes and wanes, but I do think that is a tenet we try to live up to, and I think that keeping that in the forefront of minds is really important.
Empathy is the watchword. Empathy was maybe the most repeated non-utility word that I heard at DevOps Days Ghent earlier this week. And it came up time and time again, and it came up time and time again in diverse contexts. So not only during presentations about what is or what isn't DevOps, we have to have empathy, blah, 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 but also just in conversations in general, talking about how to interact with people. Like, I was at the restaurant and the waitress was stressed out, and so I tried to be empathetic, and she really appreciated it, right? Now, I'm not going to make a leap here and say that DevOps is going to change the world and we're all going to be better people and blah blah blah, because that's ridiculous. But a lot of those words have weight, and a lot of the words that I find us employing now on a regular basis, things like empathy, things like sincerity, things like being humble, so on and so forth, are powerful words, and they're powerful actions that can have very real, very positive effects on us personally and in our work lives, and maybe even in our personal lives too, and that's huge.
And I definitely, Jan has joined us, and I definitely want to hear what he has to say about that too, but I wanted to mention that there were at least two people who actually apologized at the conference for things that they had, said or done in talks or whatever on Twitter. But like there was an Ignite Michael Ducey gave the first day that was very interesting and meta and kind of cool, kind of an art piece. But he didn't really provide a lot of explanation. And the second day, he actually took the mic again during Ignites and gave a little bit more context and explanation to make it more accessible to more people. And actually, just to say he also wants to reach out to people that he has not has had as much empathy for in the past. And there was another gentleman also who felt the need to self-correct about something that he had said, that then he wanted to say something different. And I just think that that's really, I think, unusual at a tech conference. The techie ego being what it is, we often don't want to admit when we've done or said something that we would later like to edit. And that level of self-reflection and people getting up and saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to actually reflect on what I said, and I'm going to say I should have done this a little differently, and here's how I want to do it better. That's huge. I think that's a sea change.
I wasn't there, but I would agree that just in those contexts, the more we can get better at taking ownership of our failures and realizing that we need to do something about them because we're the only people that can do something about them is kind of a big deal.
Yeah. So I'm late into this, but I was there, and it has been a few days, and the thing I remember most about the conference is those exact moments. People followers. It made an impact. Just because it was unique.
I'm running out of battery, so I'm going to quickly disappear to find a cable to transmit electricity from the wall to my Googling device. Be right back.
So Jan, you broke up. Can you try that again?
Yeah, I'm sitting in my hotel room in Lille, waiting for OpenStack Summit to begin. So I was there in Ghent, and what Bridget was talking about was what I remember most from the conference. Thinking back now, those moments where people apologized, the empathy, that was unique. And when I talked to people, my colleagues that also went, we agree that was like things like that has never happened in tech conferences with any of us before. So I hope it will continue, and yes, a start of something, because it was really nice. I felt good about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that's probably, I mean, after 5 years of being instrumental in running most of the DevOps days, I think that's probably going to be the lasting legacy of Patrick Dubois. And the personality of an organizer or of a founder of any movement is going to have an influence. It's going to have an effect. And Patrick is a very humble person who cares about others. And I think that's having an influence on how everyone at these events is trying to act. We're all trying anyway.
Well, and it goes to show just even that point of one of the things that I learned early on about Patrick when I first met him at DevOps Days, Silicon Valley. Gosh, I don't even know how long ago it was. I was still in the UC system at this point.
I think that was Mountain View 2012. I think that was our first one, and I think for both of us.
Yeah, so wow, we invoke his name and he comes. That is insane. It's Patrick! Can you hear us? But just finishing my point very, very briefly, just that it's not just about being awesome and nice, it's also being able to have frank conversations, which I appreciated. So, Patrick, welcome.
Welcome, you guys. I'm trying to figure out which screen I'm looking at. I'm not good at computers. So. Well, the only reason why I actually wanted to pop up on the show is like we had many people to thank for, and I wanted to thank you guys too for doing all the podcasts and putting all the effort in there. So for the rest, ignore me now.
Hardly. We're not ignoring you. We actually were just talking about you, so you'll have to watch that later. Or you probably won't, because you never want to watch us talking about you. You'll smile and you'll blush. But it is wonderful to see you, Patrick, because I got to the algo rave, I think, like 15 minutes after you left, so I didn't get to give you Hangops and say goodnight and goodbye. But thank you so much again for how wonderful Ghent was.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being all there. So it's cool. I'm just, I'm an addict. This is the way I kick off. It's just joining randomly podcasts.
We know there are worse ways to spend one's retirement than randomly joining podcasts. So.
Well, somebody suggested I do a Kickstarter for DevOps certification. So.
Yep, absolutely. Patrick and I have been talking about that all morning on Twitter. It's time for a proper DevOps certification.
Sure, we'll give you one every time you come to a DevOps days.
I have mine here.
That is awesome.
Soon to be framed. It's signed by Patrick Dubois, so you know it's legit.
I've got like 9 people's certifications. I'm gonna just frame them all and put them on the wall. It's gonna be great.
You have a flock of DevOps, huh?
Exactly.
We should have one of those seals made. You know, the ones that you make things official by like punching down on the paper.
Yeah, they have that
an embossed seal.
They actually had that done for Berlin edition. And we're thinking about creating this stamp and then sending it from one event to the other, like the Olympics, like the flame you share. It's kind of a gimmick we could do.
That would be fun, actually.
So Brandon, I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, I've got to run, but I could leave this running if you guys, I don't know if enough people have enough time they want to keep it running. I could just video mute myself and let you guys keep streaming and end the broadcast later. Or do we want to stop here with just a big thank you to Patrick and just tell everyone to go watch the video Nathan arranged?
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you want to thank Patrick, tweet at him with hashtag #ThankYouPatrick. And if you check it out, I'll tweet about the URL for the video itself. But we put together a video, a number of organizers from DevOps Days over the years put together a little video thanking Patrick for all of his hard work and for starting off this this movement. Thank you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. But like I said, you guys are taking it next, and that's the awesome part. So.
It's pretty exciting. Thank you, Patrick, and everyone.
Yeah. Speaking of, if any of you who are listening are, or even if you aren't listening, but you want to come visit Southern California next February, it's actually really nice here in February. Chris and I are an organizing committee for, it's not a standalone DevOps Day event, but it's a DevOps track that we do as part of the Southern California Linux Expo, which is, gosh, it started as like a lug meetup. I think this is the 13th or 14th year now. It's a big 3-day Friday, Saturday, Sunday expo, and the CFP is open until December 10th. So if you're nearby, going to be nearby, you should attend if you might be interested in speaking. Just go to SoCalLinuxExpo.org, and I think the category is DevOps in the CFP. Chris and I and a few other locals will be organizing that, or getting that lined up in December. So it's a pretty fun event, and it's only like $70, I think, to attend. It's like the entrance fee. So it's pretty cool.
If anybody is going to be in Paris or wants an excuse to come to Paris in April, we're holding DevOps Days Paris in April, and we're going to have the same excellent coffee that was available at DevOps Days Ghent. So you can come for the DevOps and stay for the coffee and also the Paris, which is okay.
Lovely. And yes, of course, as I said in Ghent, DevOps Days Minneapolis will be running again in July 2015. It will be July 8th and 9th. It's the 1 month of the year that Minnesota has never had snow.
And finishing up with some minor housekeeping stuff, we've got SysAdvent is coming up. I'm going to open up the call for the sign-up sheet probably either today or sometime between today and Monday. And we'll be back here at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, because it won't be Daylight Savings Time anymore, next week. So Friday at 11 a.m. PST.
Yeah. No topic for next week yet. In 3 weeks, I'm lining up some Kafka and production stuff, so that should be interesting. A couple people from LinkedIn and Paul Stack, I think he's been on here once or twice, from OpenTable. They're doing like 5 billion messages per week through Kafka for Logstash, so it should be interesting to talk. He was in San Francisco when I was there a couple weeks ago. We were talking about that, so it should be some good stuff there. Always looking for suggestions for people you'd like to have on here. So find me on IRC or Twitter if there's someone you want me to bring on here as a special guest. And definitely participate in SysAdvent. It's a great thing. And I think we'll just close with another thank you to Patrick. It's been a crazy 5 years to see this community go from a hashtag and a couple blog posts to just this thing with there's something every month and more and more people joining. It's really cool. So thank you for kicking off this awesome thing that's become a part of our lives.
Yes, thank you.